I now look to Peter Tatchell to continue the case for the opposition.
Mr. President, members of the Oxford Union, the motion before us tonight is: this House believes Margaret Thatcher was a hero for the working class. Having read this motion, it is evident that satire is not dead. However, I will debate this motion as if it was a serious proposition. Where to begin? Margaret Thatcher presided over the greatest assault on working class people since the 1930s. She undid the post-war settlement. She set our nation into a period of abyss and division, setting class against class, community against community. Her government decimated British industry in the name of rebuilding the economy. She destroyed what we had and left us to pick up the pieces. Indeed, some commentators at the time suggested that Margaret Thatcher's policies did more to damage British manufacturing than the Luftwaffe during the Second World War. In the early 1980s, as a direct consequence of her policies, the country was plunged into deep recession, resulting in a mass unemployment, which we've heard doubled from 1.5 million in 1979 when she came to power to over 3 million. And it hovered around, above or below, the 3 million mark from 1981 to 1988. 7 long, dark years of hopelessness for millions of people thrown on the scrap heap of the dole queue, and for their millions of dependents. She said in 1979, "Vote for me, Labour isn't working." Well, I can tell you, by comparison to her, Labour, for all its faults, was working relatively. To pursue this revolution, this counter-revolution, some might say, she pursued punitive policies to strangle and restrict the working class. A series of tough anti-union laws to restrict the democratic human right of people to withdraw their labour, a right that is enshrined in international human rights law. She made it not impossible, but much more difficult for ordinary people to withdraw their labour to defend their working lives, conditions and income. We've heard today that the unions had too much power, that the unions were holding the country to ransom. That is a lie. The people who are holding this country to ransom were the corporate bosses who refused to invest in our industries and our economy, which caused the crises of the 1970s. The response of the unions was to defend their members against that assault on their living standards and working conditions. Let us never forget that every social progress for working people in this country has not been given to them by our government. It's been fought by trade unions, which, for all their faults, and they have some, for all their faults, they were the harbingers of the progress we've won over the decades and centuries. The truth is that big business has untrammeled power, that corporate bosses have the power to hire and fire, to invest or disinvest, to hike prices. That is the dictatorship of this country even today. The very rich hold all the levers of economic power and crush anyone who dares to resist. And that is what Margaret Thatcher did. She sought to crush those who wanted to resist. She declared war on the mining communities with her plan for pit closures, or her endorsement of the NCB's plan for pit closures. Deliberately and consciously and maliciously putting thousands of miners out of work with the dire consequences for their families. No plan to ameliorate the consequences, no plan to soften the blow. It was pure, ruthless economic destruction of those pits and those communities. And of course, that all culminated in the great miners' strike of 1984-1985. You don't have to agree with Arthur Scargill or everything the unions did, but they were fighting a just battle to save their jobs and their communities. And what happened? They were branded the enemy within. The enemy within. They were treated as a threat to the state. And Margaret Thatcher's response was twin. A twin policy of starving the miners into submission. That was her professed goal, to starve the miners into submission. On strike, they couldn't get Social Security. They were dependent on the miners' welfare funds, which soon ran out. I went to those mining communities. I saw in houses with husbands and wives and 4 kids, empty cupboards. No food in those cupboards, almost empty fridges, because of that ruthless policy of Margaret Thatcher to starve them into submission. The idea was to make the families suffer, to force the menfolk back to work. The mining villages were under police occupation during that strike. If you'd been in those villages in the north of England and Scotland, as I was, in 1984, 1985, you would think you were living under a fascist dictatorship, with police monitoring all the communities, police troops marching in horseback on formation through those villages, pure, total intimidation. And when the miners sought to rally, they were treated to charges by police on horseback. Police wearing armoured shields and visors, carrying gigantic big long batons, and I saw them strike down unarmed miners and their families and supporters. This was not a democracy. This was a ruthless government, hell-bent on destroying communities and quashing any resistance and dissent. It was deliberate, malicious intimidation. Freedom of movement in this country was suspended for the duration of the miners' strike. You could not move around this country without police permission.
Nonsense.
If you were going to support the strikers, you could not move around. You could not move around the country. People who were going to try to go to pit villages to show support, to join picket lines, even just a handful of pickets, were stopped by the police, arrested, or turned back. There was this famous story about some Kent miners going up, only a busload of them, one busload, going up to support some miners in Yorkshire. And they were stopped for the crime of, quote, travelling in a northerly direction on the assumption they were going to support the miners. No basis in law for what happened to them, but that was a frequent story of that strike. As I said, I was there, I saw it. I saw the police, on the government's own instructions and orders, become a paramilitary force. They did the police's bidding. The police were no longer neutral servants of the people. They were instruments of state repression under the direct personal authorization of Margaret Thatcher and the Conservative government. And after the miners were defeated, the pits closed, whole communities were left desolate, destroyed, no jobs, no hope, dependent on Social Security. We're told that Margaret Thatcher wanted to uplift people, to give them independence and autonomy. Far from it. Those mining villages were put into dependence upon the state because their whole livelihoods, their whole being had been torn apart. So in conclusion, Mr. President, I ask you to support this motion that Margaret Thatcher was not a hero. I ask you to oppose this motion that Margaret Thatcher was a hero for the working class, because everything she did in those periods was a detriment to working class people. Thank you.